Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
It was Donald Trump's first major speech at the United Nations as president. It may be the home of international diplomacy, but there was nothing diplomatic about his attack on what he called rogue nations like Iran and North Korea. He told the General Assembly of world leaders and senior diplomats that if North Korea threatened the US or its allies, it would face total destruction. Our North America editor John Sopel reports on what the speech tells us about US foreign policy under Donald Trump.
Donald Trump is used to being the centre of attention, but rarely has the global community waited with such bated breath to hear from him at his first address to the UN General Assembly. The isolationist, America First president at the very embodiment of multilateralism and multinationalism. He was more conciliatory, but he was still Donald Trump.
As President of the United States, I will always put America first. Just like you, as the leaders of your countries, will always and should always put your countries first.
He'd come to hug his friends and wallop US enemies, and none more so than North Korea and their leader Kim Jong-un, or Rocket Man as he called him. In the Assembly, North Korea's 2 allocated seats stood conspicuously empty.
The United States has great strength and patience, but if it is forced to defend itself or its allies, we will have no choice but to totally destroy North Korea. Rocket Man is on a suicide mission for himself and for his regime. The United States is ready, willing, and able, but hopefully this will not be necessary. The Iran deal was
on the Iran nuclear deal, he hinted that America could still walk away from it. You haven't heard the last of this, he warned. But he ended up with a rallying cry for strong sovereign nations working together.
We will fight together, sacrifice together, and stand together for peace, for freedom, for justice, for family, for humanity, and for the Almighty God who made us all. Thank you. God bless you. God bless the nations of the world, and God bless the United States of America. Thank you very much.
What will stand out from this address will be his comments on North Korea. But there is no simple military solution. For all its shortcomings, the best way to make progress with Pyongyang will be via the United Nations. And the president knows it.
And John is at the UN for us this evening. John, all this talk of destroying North Korea, do we just put that down to overblown rhetoric?
Well, George, it's hard to think of another occasion where a US president has gone in and threatened to totally destroy a country belonging to another United Nations member. It's also hard to think of an occasion where a president has summoned his inner Elton John and started talking about Rocket Man. And I think it's the conjunction of these two things that is so uneasy. One, the most dangerous threat you could ever make to another sovereign country, and the other almost like a playground taunt. Now, it may not be that this is the most outspoken speech that a US president has ever given, although there were gasps in the press room and there were gasps in the Assembly at some of what Donald Trump said. But it will certainly go down as one of the most unorthodox. But it doesn't change the basic strategic issue. There is no easy military solution to North Korea, and maybe this rhetoric is a way of piling on the pressure on Russia, and more particular China, to stop doing business with North Korea if you are going to avoid a nuclear catastrophe.
John, thank you very much.
At the United Nations General Assembly, a platform that President Trump once decried but now bestrode. He has threatened to totally destroy North Korea and mocked Kim Jong-un, saying Rocket Man is on a suicide mission for himself. He accused Iran of being intent on destabilizing the Middle East and denounced socialism. It only brought anguish, devastation and failure, he said. It was a bellicose performance just minutes after UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres had urged statesmanship, in which he touched upon hotspots around the globe in front of world leaders. From New York now, Kylie Morris has this report.
We meet at a time of both immense promise and great peril. It is entirely up to us whether we lift the world to new heights or let it fall into a valley of disrepair.
But fear not, the president would explain. He has the answer: sovereignty and a return to the nation state. Put simply, everyone just needs to look after themselves and everything's going to turn out fine.
Strong sovereign nations let their people take ownership of the future and control their own destiny. And strong sovereign nations allow individuals to flourish in the fullness of the life intended by God. In America, we do not seek to impose our way of life on anyone, but rather to let it shine as an example for everyone to watch.
But in this fairy tale, there is, of course, an evil lurking.
If the righteous many do not confront the wicked few, then evil will triumph. When decent people and nations become bystanders to history, the forces of destruction only gather power and strength.
North Korea had won front seats in this year's General Assembly lottery, but they exited before President Trump began his speech. Still, it'll be ringing in their ears for a long, long time.
The United States has great strength and patience, but if it is forced to defend itself or its allies, we will have no choice but to totally destroy North Korea. Rocket Man is on a suicide mission for himself and for his regime. The United States is ready, willing, and able, but hopefully this will not be necessary. That's what the United Nations is all about. That's what the United Nations is for. Let's see how they do.
His comments rebounded around the chamber and then rocketed outside.
That it's #1 serious threat facing the United States. The problem is, I think, that rhetoric of calling Kim Jong-un names, a rocket man on a suicide mission, this is not what's going to lead North Korea to denuclearize. It's not going to lead to North Korea giving up nuclear weapons.
Next up on the rogue nation's readout was Iran.
The Iranian government masks a corrupt dictatorship behind the false guise of a democracy. It has turned a wealthy country with a rich history and culture into an economically depleted rogue state whose chief exports are violence, bloodshed, and chaos.
The Iranian delegate appeared suddenly busy on his phone as the president rounded with new vigor on America's old foe and on the nuclear deal signed 2 years ago.
The Iran deal was one of the worst and most one-sided transactions the United States has ever entered into. Frankly, that deal is an embarrassment to the United States, and I don't think you've heard the last of it, believe me.
Is that the trace of a smile on the Tehran delegate's lips? The president's performance unlikely to come as any surprise for Iran, but it's a dramatic end to any sense that deal might bring them closer together. To close, the president reached for happier thoughts, determined to leave the room with the impression he was on their team, when really, he'd explained, it's every nation for itself.
We will fight together, sacrifice together, and stand together for peace, for freedom, for justice, for family, for humanity, and for the Almighty God who made us all. Thank you. God bless you. God bless the nations of the world, and God bless the United States of America. Thank you very much.
So it was America first and America indeed to the last today. And this was Donald Trump really driving a nail into the coffin of multilateralism, as he promised his supporters he would. but it's an awkward argument, as you might imagine, to make here before the UN, which is why I think he seized on this theme of the reawakening of nation states. But where he really warmed up, as you saw, was on the issue of North Korea. The Americans are desperate for this not to be seen as their problem, but as a shared problem, and he wanted to make an impact in the room. That he did. I think the most surprising aspect of today was the kind of ferocity of his tone toward Iran. Certainly the deal he's railed against forever, but he really turned up the rhetoric. We've just heard from France's President Macron defending the Iran deal and saying that it is an example of how you fix a problem or a potential problem like North Korea.
Just a sort of domestic one, perhaps. Theresa May and Boris Johnson, both there in the building, and we understand they've not met. Kylie, how can that be?
Oh, John, it does seem strange in a place where there are, frankly, more meetings than a speed dating event pretty much every hour. And people are walking in and out of committee rooms, they're barging into lifts. It's difficult to avoid people, but apparently they have. Perhaps they just have strikingly different agendas, at least here at the UN. But there's always tomorrow. And if not, they're both scheduled, John, to be in a cabinet meeting back in the UK on Thursday morning.
Kylie Morris in New York.
In that bastion of diplomacy, the United Nations, where the world tries to sort out its problems, there was nothing very diplomatic about President Trump's first ever speech to the General Assembly tonight. I think it's fair to say that he let rip, most notably against North Korea and its leader Kim Jong-un, or Rocket Man on a suicide mission, as Mr. Trump preferred to describe him. The US president left little doubt as to his intentions. If Kim threatened America or its allies, he said, the United States would have no choice but to totally destroy North Korea.
The ride from Trump Tower to the United Nations is less than a mile. But it is an exceptionally long journey in another sense. An isolationist and nationalist American president preparing to address for the very first time the greatest global institution of all.
The Assembly will hear an address by His Excellency Donald Trump.
A clash of vision was inevitable, but the language and the tone of Trump's speech left many in this hall stunned. This was his apocalyptic warning to North Korea, complete with the mocking nickname he has given to Kim Jong-un.
The United States has great strength and patience. But if it is forced to defend itself or its allies, we will have no choice but to totally destroy North Korea. Rocket Man is on a suicide mission for himself and for his regime.
Ironically, the delegation from Pyongyang was positioned immediately in front of him, though the principal diplomats had walked out, leaving empty seats. Trump then demanded other countries isolate North Korea and other rogue nations.
If the righteous many do not confront the wicked few, then evil will triumph.
Yes, the so-called axis of evil appears to be back. Trump next took on Iran and the 2015 nuclear deal that is regarded by US allies, including the British, as a major diplomatic achievement.
The Iranian government masks a corrupt dictatorship behind the false guise of a democracy. It has turned a wealthy country with a rich history and culture into an economically depleted rogue state whose chief exports are violence, bloodshed, and chaos. The Iran deal was one of the worst and most one-sided transactions the United States has ever entered into. Frankly, that deal is an embarrassment to the United States, and I don't think you've heard the last of it, believe me.
The Iranians have warned America of grave consequences if the deal is torn up. The Israelis and the Saudis will be the only ones thrilled by Trump's threat. This was a dark speech in which he warned of chaos.
Major portions of the world are in conflict, and some, in fact, are going to hell.
Many in this hall were also alarmed at issues that Trump did not mention. The more aggressive posture of Russia, for example, or climate change, or the humanitarian disaster unfolding in Myanmar. The president made few friends here today, and took even allies aback with this performance.
I think the United Nations has great potential. It needs that potential right now just about more than at any time ever before.
And even as he spoke of the UN's vital role, he now cuts an even more unpredictable figure on the world stage.
I said, reflected Donald Trump afterwards, what I had to say. Certainly today's Donald Trump didn't hold back. His address to the UN General Assembly in New York was like the Axis of Evil speech on steroids. In his sights were Iran, Syria, Cuba and Venezuela, a sort of rogue Eurovision of nations. His message to North Korea's leader, a rocket man on a suicide mission, was a threat of total destruction. There was a theatricality to his words that drew gasps from the audience. But there was another side to Trump, a leader who rejected globalization, rejected America as the world's policeman, who admitted he was less keen to receive the poor, tired, huddled masses yearning to breathe free, more interested in keeping them in their own homes and countries with a little more financial aid. Above all, it was a speech to those who'd elected him, a speech to those who wanted to hear their leader repeat that America, its problems and its solutions would be put first. He encouraged other states to think the same way. Here's Mark Urban with his take on Trump's doctrine.
The address to the UN General Assembly is a grand presidential tradition, as are references to the US Constitution, although Trump used his to advocate governing in the US interest.
As President of the United States, I will always put America first. Just like you, as the leaders of your countries, will always and should always put your countries first.
And if that drew applause, it was because Trumpian ideas about respecting other systems are welcome to those who are lukewarm about the Western democratic model.
In America, we do not seek to impose our way of life on anyone, but rather to let it shine as an example for everyone to watch.
Indeed, the president even made explicit that America's values are not for export, a clean break with George W. Bush and Barack Obama's ideas of spreading democracy and human rights. But this president also set out the limits to his acceptance of other systems.
We do not expect diverse countries to share the same cultures, traditions, or even systems of government. But we do expect all nations to uphold these two core sovereign duties: to respect the interests of their own people and the rights of every other sovereign nation.
It seemed almost to amount to a Trump doctrine.
His team seemed to be trying to explain why America first and nationalism sort of was consistent with leadership in the world. But I think what we saw was really an echoing of many of the things Putin has said over the years about sovereignty. His critique of the international order has been that it doesn't really respect the sovereignty of its members.
But of course, the rubric of threatening others can certainly be extended to North Korea, and Kim Jong-un was duly threatened.
Now North Korea's reckless pursuit of nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles threatens the entire world with unthinkable loss of human life. The United States has great strength and patience, but if it is forced to defend itself or its allies, we will have no choice but to totally destroy North Korea.
Iran was flayed too, although the president stopped short of saying he'd junked the nuclear deal. And he could excoriate the old socialist enemy when he attacked the Venezuelan government. It sounded at times like a reversioning of President Bush's axis of evil.
It's not clear yet exactly what the president's foreign policy ideology is, what his guiding vision is. But certainly we see selective engagement on issues or on countries when it comes to human rights where there may be a political cost not to do anything and a political benefit to do something. So it may really all come down to politically what's feasible for him.
And although Policy Director Steve Bannon has left the White House now, swipes at mammoth international organisations, mass immigration and unequal trade deals lived on as the bête noire from the Trump campaign.
For too long, the American people were told that mammoth multinational trade deals, unaccountable international tribunals, and powerful global bureaucracies were the best way to promote their success. And our great middle class, once the bedrock of American prosperity, was forgotten and left behind. But they are forgotten no more, and they will never be forgotten again.
His predecessor drew a warmer reception for this annual address, but there were a few lines that drew applause, not least because there are plenty of states here that are glad America has stopped trying to export its version of democracy.
Mark Urban, we can pick up on some of Mark's thoughts. Joining me now from New York, Kevin Rudd, the former Australian PM who was at the UN today, and from Washington, Kurt Volker, Director of the McCain Institute for International Leadership and US Special Representative to Ukraine. Kevin Rudd, thanks for joining us. Let me start with you. Your thoughts this evening. Do you understand Trump's foreign policy credo?
No, I don't. What you see, of course, is an unvarnished nationalism on display here in New York. It's a speech primarily directed at an American domestic audience. I think what the president has forgotten is that the United States, who actually invented the post-45 global rules-based order, it was the United States that invented the United Nations, and it was the United States that invented the Bretton Woods institutions. And it was the United States which brought about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. These are all American babies. And therefore, for the President of the United States, I think uniquely in post-45 history, to stand up and publicly shred those things is odd. Not only is it odd, but it was not substituted by any, shall I say, coherent alternative doctrine other than American nationalism.
Unless he's actually more in tune with our times and is saying things that many people might quietly agree with. The principle of the UN, of course, is non-interference. There'll be many countries who think his approach to the refugee problem is the right one. Could he not be more in time with the UN of 2017?
Well, I think if you look at the period from 45 to the present, there's been a lot of change in that period of time, and it would be wrong to assume that nationalism had not raised its ugly head many times over those 7 decades. I think the responsibility of great powers in international history is to create rules-based order where on matters of common interests and global values we choose to pool our sovereignty to deal with those, whether it's on questions of climate, whether it's on questions of peace and international security, or whether it's on questions of how to deal with stateless persons in a refugees crisis. That's what great powers do.
Let me ask you very bluntly, you heard his threat to North Korea, put in the context, of course, as the US having to defend itself. How likely do you feel it would be for him to follow through? If you were PM of Australia now, what would you be putting in place or thinking?
The first thing I'd be doing if I was Prime Minister in Australia now would be on the phone to my South Korean counterpart, working out a combined approach to the White House about why that would be a very bad idea. I think the bottom line is, if you look at what's happening in Washington, and I'm president of the Asia Society Policy Institute here in New York, and I observe American politics and American foreign policy professionally, is that there are two sets of options here. One is the United States simply accepts the legitimacy of North Korea becoming a bona fide, a nuclear state with an ICBM capability of reaching mainland America, or two, that the United States takes unilateral military action of one form or another to degrade or to destroy that nuclear capability. But there's a third, which is a new diplomacy, which tries to strike a grand bargain between China, the United States, and North and South Korea. That's where the Americans should be focusing.
Let me turn to Kurt. You have a bird's eye view, of course, Kurt, from Washington. What is your sense of what you heard today? Was it a Trump that you can take out to the world and celebrate, defend?
Well, I'd say a couple things, and reacting a little bit to what Kevin said. I think, yes, he was talking to a domestic audience, but he was also talking to an international audience. And I think he was expressing, as you indicated, Emily, a frustration that a lot of people feel, that we face a lot of challenges in the world, some very darkening clouds on the horizon. North Korea is one of them. There are others, terrorism and other. And people are concerned that these aren't being dealt with. So I think he was speaking to that frustration. And what he was doing, and it's important to go back to the beginning of his remarks, because I think a lot of the things you've pulled out are kind of getting to the specific threats at the end. But in the very beginning, he's talking about promoting or supporting peace, democracy, prosperity, security, and the United Nations being formed for that purpose. And now we face a situation in which we need nations to pull together to actually do that.
But, for example, yesterday, Kurt, I mean, we heard NATO saying that we should be deeply worried about Russia. Doesn't it seem to you inconceivable that a US president should go to the UN, make a 41-minute speech and not even mention Russia or the dangers it poses?
Yeah, no, I was surprised to not find that there. There was one reference to Ukraine and speaking about supporting sovereignty, talking about Ukraine's sovereignty. Well, there's only one country that has invaded and taken part of Ukraine's territory, so
on
we
that
know
note,
what that's about.
When he said he was going to reject, I think his line was reject threats to sovereignty from Ukraine to the South China Sea, how did you interpret that? Does it mean that America would be a policeman, would go to the rescue of Ukraine, or he keeps coming short, doesn't he, of action?
Yeah, well, I think in terms of launching a war, to say, okay, we're going to go fight a war, I don't think he was going that far. But he was calling out what are these very challenges that you're referring to, whether he referred to dictators or referred to terrorists, and saying we face in our time right now a lot of challenges. And he's calling them out and saying we've got, as a United Nations, as nations and sovereign nations that need to exercise responsibility, we've got to actually deal with these, as was the purpose at the UN's founding.
Kevin Rudd, do you treat President Trump as a man who is likely to act on his words? It was quite interesting to see Matterson McMaster come out straight away saying we need to work through diplomatic means and international means. Do you respond to President Trump as a man who will follow through?
I think President Trump, in the period he's been in office, has shown a remarkable ability to move from one set of strong words onto a different set of expressions the next week or the next month. So I think we should take the specific language as it relates to North Korea in this speech with a bit of a grain of salt. It's consistent with the president's general frustration with the North Koreans' approach to the nuclear program. He's legitimately frustrated by the fact that China has been unable or unwilling to turn the North Korean program around. But I think would be wrong to predict a particular course of action coming out of this speech. That's not the way in which this White House operates. And you have a competent national security team around him as well.
Kurt Volker, it's curious, isn't it, the way he goes along the line of insult. He insults Iran, he insults Venezuela, and yet he doesn't actually pull out of the deal. What do you make of that? It's almost the opposite of diplomacy, isn't it?
Well, I think he's trying to demonstrate toughness. He's trying to get attention so that things are paid attention to. In the case of North Korea, I think he's trying to engage in very tough rhetoric in order to get Kim Jong-un's attention and to get him to believe that there would be massive retaliation, and through that to hopefully deter him. The whole essence of deterrence is the certainty on the adversary's side that there will be a massive retaliation. So I think he's trying to convey that through that strong language.
Kurt Volker, Kevin Rudd, thank you both very much. Thanks.